Hey guys, I am Dr. Kim Sage. Welcome to my YouTube channel. This video is really about the impact of fathers and meant to be posted today on Father's Day. It's a little bit late, but hopefully better late than never. I made this video several days ago and then I decided to remake it, and it's part of the reason why it's a bit late. I just felt like it didn't quite, something was missing. And I couldn't figure out what it was. And as I thought more and more about it, it actually really hit me this morning, which is not only do we have an impact of narcissistic fathers and borderline fathers and fathers who just struggle on days like Father's Day, which I think is a very triggering holiday for so many of us for so many reasons. Whether you've lost a father or grieving a father you never had, you know, it's so complicated, and these Hallmark holidays shouldn't be so triggering, but they truly are. But as I was thinking about this video, what really hit me was there are a million videos about narcissism, and I don't expect, you know, I'm going to say anything today that you have never heard before. Maybe, but probably not. But where I think it's so triggering is not only do we have a day like Father's Day, where we grieve our own father experience, especially if it came at the expense of us being seen in childhood, but especially when we often recreate the same narcissistic dynamics in the partners we choose, and therefore in our children's lives. And so those wounds just get, you know, repeated again and again. And it does, you know, it is somewhat common that if you had a, let's say for example, an untreated borderline mother, a narcissistic parent or father or mother, you know, you may be more likely to then unconsciously choose partners who are similar. I think when you have, let's say, a borderline mother, especially, that just like borderlines themselves can be drawn to narcissists, as their children, we can be drawn to narcissists, because in the beginning they often present and seem so stable, so whole, so capable of holding us, right? That sort of classic holding environment, their confidence, their ability to sort of just come across as like they've got it under control, can be deeply attractive when we have so longed for emotional stability, for financial stability. Often narcissists, you know, they do well financially often. There's just this sort of magnetizing ability they can have in the beginning. Now, of course, you don't have to have a borderline parent or narcissistic parent also, but I do think that these types of wounds tend to beget more types of wounds. It is that very classic generational trauma. And so what I want to talk about today is the impact of narcissists upon their children, and not just sort of what we know, but how that plays out in our adult lives and how it can continue to manifest because we often choose similar partners. So you're not just grieving or feeling angry or trying to set boundaries or dealing with that deep less than-ism from your own narcissistic father, but you are often dealing with it every day through your current marriage, through the partners you're choosing that you date, through co-parenting an ex. And we all know, unless, you know, if you have any sort of wisdom about divorcing a narcissist, especially if they didn't want you to leave them, it is almost a never-ending trauma trigger you can be locked into if you have to co-parent, because you can't just go gray rock. And you watch your kids suffer with the same things that you suffered with. And so that can be really hard to deal with. So you can stay trapped in these cycles. So as I always say, I think the way to heal is to first understand it so that you can become aware of it. And so that is what we're going to talk about today. So if you're just tuning in, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I would love for you to join my channel. Please feel free to subscribe and click the bell, and that way you'll get notified when I post new videos. All right, so let's just go through in this video some of the things I think we struggle with when our fathers have narcissism, and what that looks like, and then some things I'll just kind of brush over at the end that you might consider exploring in terms of doing some healing work for yourself. Now, I'm not going to go into all of the impacts because there really are a lot of impacts in terms of having a father like this. Of course, the role of father in its ideal form is supposed to bring a component to mothering, right? There's supposed to be, regardless of how you identify or the roles you have, but there's an energy to fathering historically that has been about feeling held and also being encouraged to take more risks, right? Also nurturing, all those things matter. But when we don't get that, and in fact the narcissist is so unable to attune to us emotionally, to be empathic, to truly see us, we're just always desperately longing to be seen. And it's almost like, look at me, Dad, look what I can do. Now you'll see me. Or if I just talk to you about it, or I share my feelings and you'll get it. And yet time and time again, that doesn't happen. And as I was saying earlier, that same thing often happens in the partners we choose, and we just can't figure out why. And one more thing quickly before I go into this is that it also depends on the child role you took in the narcissistic family. Were you the scapegoat? Were you the invisible child? Were you, the child who really represented the golden child in terms of how the narcissist sees themselves? And so those roles can all truly make a difference. So it really does matter, the role, and oftentimes we find in narcissistic families, the siblings often get pitted against one another. And so we can see these very different experiences, from the child who speaks up to the child who takes it, to the child who is that reflection of the father. And it often can create this sort of every man for himself dynamics in the siblings. And sometimes we don't see as close of relationships as we could because there's always this pitting against one another in those situations. And so that's something you should be aware of. If you can't quite figure out why, it always felt like each of you were sort of on your own path with the same parent, that can be a big part of it. So the first thing is we learn that love is conditional and that love is not consistent, right? And so because we are really only valued when the narcissist sees us as valuable, we very quickly learn that certain things are more lovable and that we can't count on being loved just for who we are, no matter what we do. And so we then choose partners who reinforce that narrative. And so we become the next thing, which is people pleasers and caretakers. We believe that if we just rotate around, giving you what you need, and or showing you how great we are, performing and delivering, and making you proud of us by being good partners, looking a certain way, achieving something, whatever it is the narcissist values, we learn that in childhood, that is how we are going to get love. And so it's a great way for us to try to heal, those childhood wounds, thinking that if we just do more, we will be loved. Now, the next part of that is that at the core, we have great self-doubt and imposter syndrome, and we're often driven by perfectionism, meaning that no matter what we do, we rotate around you, we try to get love, we don't. It is never enough, and we are never enough. And the ironic part is that is really truly the core at times of what the narcissist believes and feels, but we internalize that. And so even when we are doing well in our lives, with other partners, at work, with our kids, it's like the standard is always just, the bar has always been moved just a little bit further. And so we often struggle with great self-doubt, even though we are doing everything in our power to be loved unconditionally, to be loved consistently, to take care of others. At the core, we have a deep feeling of we are worthless, we're never enough. And depending upon how severe that narcissistic rage is, and if there are some borderline flavors, of course, we can also go into a very much bad, I am unworthy, but the core really is about never being enough. Along those same lines, as we're doing all of that, both in childhood and in our adult lives, we begin to, really struggle with often typical complex trauma symptoms, issues with anxiety and depression, and being sort of transported either back to childhood in relationships or feeling like in our childhood that we have to just manage it all. So we start to develop this very internal struggle with with, tap dancing around the narcissist. And that can create a lot of anxiety, attachment anxiety, wondering if we're going to be accepted and loved, trying to meet their needs, and all of that manifesting in our own bodies, often through chronic illness, through, other relational struggles. It just becomes this chaos inside that often really, connects, unfortunately, well to typical symptoms with mental health. Now, alongside those issues, depending upon, like I'm saying too, how severe the behaviors are, even though we just have traits, they can be severe too. But as it gets worse, if anger is an issue, if conflict, often constant criticism and control, all that manifests. And when we're little kids, we sort of accept it and internalize it, right? It's something wrong with me. But oftentimes, depending upon the role you take with a narcissist as a child and in your adult relationships, the stronger you become, the more you tap into more adolescent pushback energy on some level, that becomes very threatening to the narcissist. And so they will then push back harder on you. More shame, more punishment, more guilt, more blame. And so the more we try to grow and separate and say, I'm not you, as we're supposed to do, the more punishment and shame we receive. And so if that happened to you in your adolescence, you have learned that your attempts at autonomy and independence didn't go so well. And so oftentimes that fear of being punished again or shamed, or, a fear of conflict, whatever it is, that then gets transferred into your adult relationship with a narcissist. And so you stuff down conflict, you take it, you please, but deep inside, that root in you of wound and resentment and anger is growing. And where I see it come out a lot too in my practice is it often comes out with, let's say, a wife or a spouse on the kids. They misdirect their anger and their projection of wound onto their children. And let's face it, kids, and even let's say, spicier kids, but kids in general, if you're looking to be, worn out and stressed and project some anger, kids do all kinds of things, most of which are not angry provoking. They're just frustrating or intolerant. But when we're holding so much inside of us, so much anxiety and anger and irritation and rejection and wound, and we can't confront the narcissist, either we can't do it directly or we haven't even actually seen it in ourselves because it just feels like home. We just, sort of feel this vague sense of irritation or anger towards them or even hatred, but we don't deal with it because that is familiar. Kids become a really easy way to take all those angry feelings and start getting mad at your kids and snapping at them and irritable and frustrated and giving them, high standards and being critical and controlling yourself, and or even manifesting your own narcissistic traits because that is what is familiar. And so all of that can really add to our own difficulties inside, our own, like I'm saying, mental health, and our difficulty healing and confronting it and setting boundaries, which is the next thing we have learned with narcissists, that we don't get to set boundaries, that there is a price to pay for setting them. And so they weren't modeled, they weren't accepted, they were constantly pushed and not tolerated. And all of that makes it really hard for us to then do and say the things in the relationships, even if it's an ex-co-parenting relationship. Because with most narcissists, if you have any kind of money going on, especially in a court situation, narcissists will wield their power to punish you in that regard. And if you've ever been involved in family law, I'm sure you know that it's not exactly the most equitable situation. It doesn't exactly bode well. And narcissists can do really well in the legal system because they can present well, because they have certain amounts of money to hire certain lawyers, or because they are really good at manipulation and gaslighting. And that is the next thing, right? Is their gaslighting that we had in childhood, that we learned through gaslighting, part of the impact, is that we can't necessarily trust what we feel and see. Maybe we are being too sensitive. Maybe we did underestimate the situation. Maybe we are crazy. Maybe we often get foggy and confused. Narcissists are great. Narcissists are great. I'm going to say it again, at creating a sense of fogginess and confusion. And that is what happens to us in childhood because we often get these mixed experiences, especially if, let's say, you had a more borderline mother who was able to love and engage or co-parent, and then you had this narcissistic father who was coming at you but also rewarding you. It really can create a lot of confusion. And so all of that gaslighting, which happened in childhood and happens with narcissists in your adult life, makes it where it's hard for you to trust yourself at times, especially if you don't have, support, or you're not doing therapy or reading books or sort of doing your healing work. You kind of get sucked back into that whole dynamic that you had in childhood. And it plays out, whether it's still in the relationship, in an ex relationship, in a co-parenting relationship. And the most painful part is you see all of these dynamics happening in your own children oftentimes. As your own children walk that same path of understanding and trying to engage, with their own narcissistic father, oftentimes they will act narcissistic themselves like the father. They will become extremely feeling unworthy inside and self-critical. And then you see that in your kids, and it just becomes really, really difficult. And so this issue with narcissists, which at times I think, God, like, what else can I share about this? It is such an overdone topic in some regards. Some by professionals, a lot of people who are just calling themselves, experts, and they are in many cases, I suppose, but regardless of it, it's everywhere. And yet the reality is the abuse and the wound of this very self-focused thinking, lacking empathy, lacking attunement, lacking reciprocity, critical, controlling behavior, even if it's also more victimized behavior, where the narcissist is not your grandiose sort of caricature narcissist, but they're like a very much, oh, poor me narcissist. Regardless, it really is hurtful. And so I do understand why we talk about it so much. But I really think, as I was saying earlier today, that it's really hard when you grow up a certain way and then you realize you have recreated the patterns, and you also feel on some level powerless to stop them. Yes, you can work on yourself. Yes, you can set boundaries. Yes, you can work on communication. But it really can be sort of a trauma that can feel like it never ends, especially if you have your own children reliving a lot of the same things that you did, and or you are still in a very toxic relationship with your narcissistic parent. So I would highly encourage you to do whatever work you can in that regard. The last thing I think, like I'm saying, is where it really plays out, it really is in our attachment patterns, is in that reproduction of relationships. And so I do think that doing the work and understanding it, maybe you can't go back and change the relationship you already chose or the person you had kids with, but you can work on, how you begin to understand what love looks like, and do some work maybe in therapy and some healing work with others, and trying to build newer, healthier relationships in your adult life, because all of this manifests, like I'm saying, in ways that are often difficult to understand and difficult to heal. But you can do it. And so here are some ways you can work on your own healing. You can obviously, try to find an attachment-based, trauma-based therapist, because a lot of what this creates is that typical complex trauma, interpersonal trauma, really, pain and wound at the hands of caregivers who really should have been safe and yet are not. You can do things like go no contact if needed, and many people do and find that is the most helpful thing they can do to manage. You could have a more gray rock relationship, a more surface relationship, but what you cannot do is keep walking back down that same road and expecting different results. It just doesn't usually happen. So all of that can help. Things like I'm saying, reparenting work, inner child work, looking at healing those wounds you have inside, internalizing a more idealized parent, and loving yourself and talking to yourself in ways that you should have heard in childhood, working on the partners that you choose today. I would say exercises like mindfulness, trauma therapies, polyvagal sort of therapy, and healing your autonomic nervous system and how your body has learned to be oftentimes hypervigilant and on alert, and or shutting down and collapsing in the face of narcissistic and toxic relationships. I'm going to be posting more about that one soon. Doing things like journaling to your inner child, focusing on gratitude. A lot of these things sound just like, okay, I know all those, but you really have to look at it from not just the lens of what happened to you, but how you may still be living it today and how that may be interfering with the work you're doing, because you get sort of literally emotionally in an emotional flashback transported back into your childhood where you feel powerless to create change in your adult relationship with a narcissist today, regardless of whether or not that's your current partner, a parent, a boss, a sibling, whatever. So the bottom line is really working on things like your worthiness issues, your trauma triggers, how to create a more mindfully present autonomic nervous system sort of engagement in the world that is more regulated, that is not so triggered, to be mindful of things like boundaries and making decisions wisely about how you engage with the narcissist in your life today. It needs to be a mindful, reflective, hit the pause button kind of thing. And I think that is incredibly difficult when we are often being triggered and reacting from our own wounds. And so we lose sight of how we need to respond, how it's going to benefit us and, let's say, our kids if we have a co-parent narcissist, or our parent, to be able to see it for what it really is and to ask ourselves questions about whether or not we can stay in relationship. But at the end of the day, I want you to know that it is very common to recreate these relationships, and it takes work to begin to change and heal your life, but you truly can do it. But you have to really, truly come to terms with and accept, I believe, where this comes from in your own childhood. If you keep choosing partners or you've chosen a partner, my experience is that it doesn't come out of nowhere. People who have healthier role models, not always, but tend to choose healthier partners. And so we're all, as I believe, always choosing to heal, even just your more typical sort of range of childhood experiences. We are seeking safety and security. And so often in a narcissist, it can look like that in the beginning. And yet it is actually one of the most dangerous relationships for ourselves, our kids, and others. So regardless of how you arrived here today, I hope that this day, in some ways, this Father's Day idea is something that you can have, really love and compassion for yourself about. That while you're watching all of the great Father's Day cards in the aisles, and or you can't pick a card and you're reading all the cards and thinking, well, I need to give a card, but none of these really say what I really feel. But if I don't say enough, he's going to hate that too. That is not uncommon. And so knowing that, it really is your choice. You get to create a new relationship today, but be mindful of how you do it, wrapping yourself in love and protection as you do so, and knowing that you're not alone. So thanks for watching. I hope that you are taking good care of yourselves, and please stay safe and well, and I'll see you next time.